But it could be leveling off. These could be signs that social distancing is working.
Good afternoon, participants, and good morning and good evening to those of you joining from different time zones. Good afternoon and welcome to all the observers who've joined us on the YouTube live broadcast as well. With no further ado, we're going to begin this session. And I'm going to pass the floor to the co-facilitators of the Needs Determination Report.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Zaid Fakir. I'm one of the co-facilitators of this needs report from the Standing Committee on Finance. I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar virtual meeting. In the interest of time, I'm going to try and go rapidly through this. My co-facilitator, Matthias, is also on the call. He'll take over the second part of the call. But before I start, I just hope everybody is staying safe, everybody is healthy, and please continue to do so. Firstly, just as by way of introduction, I'd like to just give you a sense of the objective of this call. We'd like to give you an update of the work of the Standing Committee on Finance in the preparation of the first ever report on the determination of needs of developing countries in implementing the Convention and its Paris Agreement. As well as we want to use this call to get the stakeholders' thoughts and their information so that you can share with us some of your thoughts and information. Briefly, how the call will be organized. We will start off with an introduction, background, and approach. I will then hand over to the various team members that are dealing with the individual chapters. They'll take you through the various chapters, and then we'll open the floor for discussions. Just quickly on housekeeping, could I ask everybody to just please mute yourself unless you are speaking. Don't share any screens or files. And there are two options to communicate. The one is the chat function. So for those that are working off a computer, if you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a icon with a chat. If you click on that, you'll be able to either send a message to individuals on the chat or to the whole group, or you could raise your hand. And the raising the hand, if you click on the icon with the participants, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, there's two buttons, one mute me and the other is raise the hand. So if you want to take the floor, just click on the raise the hand, that's the other option. But that will start then with the presentation. Firstly, I'd like to say that you would know that the Standing Committee on Finance is a constituted body of the Convention, and it also serves the Paris Agreement. It also does work in terms of assisting the COP in its exercising its functions in terms of the financial mechanisms of the Convention. Furthermore, the preparation of the report of the needs report is one of the new work streams of the Standing Committee that has been mandated to the Standing Committee. This mandate comes from a decision taken in Katowice at COP24. Just to briefly go through the decision itself, so if you look at that decision, it firstly confirmed the mandates in Article 11, Para 3D, and then there was decisions 12 CP2, 12 CP3, 5 CP19 and 1 CP21. It then requested the Standing Committee to prepare a report every 4 years on the determination of needs of developing countries related to the implementation of the Convention and its Paris Agreement. And this is for consideration at COP26 and the CMA3. Furthermore, it requested collaboration with the operating entities of the financial mechanism, collaboration with the subsidiary and constituted bodies, with various multilateral and bilateral channels, as well as with observer organizations. So that roughly gives you a sense of what the Standing Committee mandate was that was presented to us. In terms of the work itself and the milestones, many of you will know that the Standing Committee on Finance agreed at its 21st meeting on the outline of the work plan of the report, including its outreach activities. On the basis of that, a call for evidence was launched in November, and so far has attracted a total of 16 submissions. All these submissions are available on the Standing Committee's website under the information repository page, and we thank all of those that have made submissions. The deadline for submission has been extended, and we would encourage interested organizations to make submissions if they wish to do so until the 30th of June. So building on the initial work that was undertaken last year, the technical team has done preliminary work, starting with information and data gathering and the drafting of individual chapters as they will present very shortly. Work, I would remind colleagues, is still at an early stage, and therefore this call is very timely as it gives us the opportunity to discuss the latest developments in data availability methodologies and other issues relating to the determination of needs of developing countries from national, regional, and global reports. And it gives us the opportunity at the fairly early stage. I would like to just then go through two elements. The one is the source of information, and the other, the approach that was taken in terms of that. So in relation to the source of information, you will note that the mapping of available information and national and regional and global reports. Colleagues, can you please mute your phones so we can pick up your discussions in the background? Thank you very much. So we've done a mapping of the available information, national, regional, global reports, analyzing the needs by country, by region, by areas, by sectors, by means of implementation and timeframes. And the timeframes here we're looking at are short, medium, and long term. National reports that are being considered. These are the BORs, the NAPs, the NDCs, the NAPAs, the TNAs, all these different reports, the long-term emission development strategies, the national communications of each country. They're also looking at expanding this to analyze the country programs of the Global Environment Facility, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and multilateral development banks. For regional and global reports, the information captured in the annexes of the background papers that was at the SCF, the 20th and the 21st meetings, as well as the background papers that are accompanying this work now are being considered. These background papers are available on the respective meeting pages of the SCF website. And additionally to that, reports relating to national contexts from multilateral banks, the UN agencies, and other institutions are also being considered to complement the information and data gathered so far. In addition to that, all submissions that have been received to the response for call for evidence will be considered. In terms of the approach that we've been taken, given that there's a vast amount of information, and here we're talking of in excess of 1,200 national reports, there's been limited time to consider all the information from national reports, and therefore a sample approach has been taken. In terms of a sample approach, this means for illustrative purposes only, a sample of 11 developing country parties representing all regions was identified to illustrate the availability and the types of information. In other instances, dummy data was used merely to showcase how information and data could be presented. So for the next iteration of this draft document, the information and data from all developing countries will be considered. Furthermore, due to the limited data set considered so far, it's rather premature to draw any findings or conclusions. Rather, what will be presented should be viewed as an opportunity to demonstrate how to present the available information and data on the needs of developing country parties, and to have an exchange on the latest developments in methodological approaches, issues, the availability, and gaps. With this introduction, I would like to invite the team to introduce their preliminary work that was done for the core chapters. And here we have our members of the team. I will start by giving the floor to Heidi, who will talk to chapter 2. Thereafter, George will talk to chapter 3. Sandra will talk to us on chapter 4, and Atina on chapter 5. So with that, Heidi, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Jahir, for the intro, and thanks for the Secretariat to organize this meeting. Hi, everyone who attend the meeting. My name is ID. Before this presentation, I just want to note that the presented information in this chapter, as earlier explained, is still driven by early data extracted. So it's partial. And this zero draft in particular used to explore the breadth of data which can be accessed and analyzed. So here the flow might not be yet synchronized with the rest of the chapters, but it shows some examples of how data of developing countries needs using the dummy data as explained. The data are taken for now are mainly from the official reports submitted to the UNFCCC. But in this chapter later on, there might be other subsections which present secondary data from other sources like the MDBs. But we still put this as placeholder right now, and there's time limitation to present. So for now, this chapter is also not yet including data from call for evidence. And so if you have some ideas, suggestions on how to present the developing country needs data, most welcome to contribute after the presentation and the session. Next, please. Okay, so to give you the overview of the data, we do have abundant information on developing country needs. As earlier explained, there are more than 1,200 reports. However, the way we could analyze it is still limited, and it's very difficult to have some aggregation. So to give you some illustration of how much the data, in average, there are about 4 to 7 national reports per country in database. So we do some mapping of the data sources of national reports from 154 countries. We see that each report has a different way to present their country needs. Some full with descriptive text only, some with project list with nominal values, and there are also combination. Sorry, going back, yeah. Some still mixing between the two. So we see that not all countries also submit reports to the UNFCCC. As you can see in the pie chart, the black and the gray. So there are countries without country submissions. Sorry, there is no country with national report, and also there are several countries with very few reports. And so there are some also, on the other hand, countries with abundant reports, like one country submit 18 reports. So there are imbalance between countries with a lot of data and countries without data at all, assuming that these countries still needs financial support. So we also not yet 100% complete in terms of extracting this data. We just use some examples as later on shown in the next few slides. So this should not be treated as final figures if you see some examples, because the figures will likely to change once we extract more data. Next, please. Okay, so to handle the interim data we have on our hands, the first thing to do that we do is basically surveying the balance between how many qualitative and quantitative information. So we're kind of short for the qualitative information that we're still figuring out how to extract and communicate that further. Given that there are so many differences among countries. So we find that most available data are qualitative actually in nature. The proportion of countries providing quantitative and qualitative information is also variable across report. Like for example, in BUR, there are more quantitative information. So there are 37 extra countries with extra quantitative information. While in national communication, only 10 countries providing qualitative plus quantitative information. So it's varied across reports. We also identify gaps on information, and we find ways to present the fragmented data in a meaningful way in this particular draft period. Next, please. So these are some possible ways for analysis, which should be seen only as examples. We just want to show that there are some analysis can be done based on time frame and scope. So it is still possible to some extent, and it also gives some insights. For example, on the left-hand side, the figure is made using data of Transformative Action Plan, and we show that two main sectors we highlight, which is water and agriculture. And it shows that short-term projects are dominated by water sector, while it does make sense that project in agriculture sector is more long-term in nature. So it's more than 10 years if you see the green bar the highest on the right side. And the second example on the right-hand side, the gray bar shows that short-term projects below 5 years, actually there are more of them, by the way, but the amount of money needed in total from those abandoned projects is actually much less than long-term ones, which is also unspecified in terms of time frame. So it's not long-term, sorry, it's not specified in terms of when it's needed and actually how long does this project actually last. So these are just two examples to showcase how data can be analyzed, and this only based on quantitative information. Next, please. These other examples show some specificities of data. On the left side, it shows that the NDC has a large number of data unspecified. So if it's comparing across reports and data sources. And in terms of themes, transformative action plans have clear division regarding the themes for each project. So we can clearly identify how much is mitigation and adaptation, while in NDC, there are a huge amount of financial needs. It's unclear whether that's adaptation, mitigation, or mix for others. And the last example on the right-hand side shows that how data availability may not correspond with the amount of needs. For example, this is like what mentioned before. We take some dummies. Just comparing, if you see the Lao example of Lao PDR, it has all list of project with the financial information. So let's say from 100 project lists with all of them filled in terms of financial needs. The amount is still smaller compared to, let's say, Mongolia, which only identify financial information from the project list around 70% or 65%. But the amount of that needs is much higher. So it doesn't mean that the fully identified project list with the financial information has a higher amount in the overall analysis. And interesting also that there are some countries without, let's say, mitigation it's only showing all the adaptation, like Burkina Faso. So this is just a few examples, and I will come to just discuss further how other data can be also presented. Thank you. I hand over to George for the next chapter.
So hi everyone. Thank you, Adi, for that interesting introduction. For me, I was focusing on the major processes and approaches that various countries are adopting in identifying their needs. And this is what we're going to discuss in this chapter. Next, please. So in this process, we went through a couple of steps, around 5 of them. The first step was basically reviewing of the documents that have been submitted by countries to the UNFCCC. This is according to, or some of them have been presented by Fakir. So we looked at those documents, and from those documents, we were mainly interested in looking at the approaches and the processes that governments are adapting in developing their needs that are captured in those reports. So after looking at a couple of reports, we realized that most countries define approaches and processes differently. So what we are doing now is taking all the various processes and approaches that are defined by countries independently, and then trying to cluster those into major categories or into known approaches. So then we can go deeper into each and every process to identify some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses, and also make some recommendations. We are not at that process yet, but that's what we are thinking, where we are thinking to go. On step 3, we are also very keen on finding out what kind of various institutional arrangements that countries are adopting in identifying these needs. And here mainly we are looking at who was the lead institution, because this determines a lot how the needs were captured. Was the lead institution or a national level institution? Was it a regional government level institution? Or was it a local authority or something like that? So we are keen and identify what were the lead institutions and what kind of arrangements did the various institutions that fed into that process have? Were they just submitting their needs, or were they also involved in an engagement and a discussion process to identify these needs? We were also very keen to see at what level within governments that these processes were sanctioned. In most countries, you have the involvement of the highest office on the land. That is the prime minister or the president's office. But in some countries, it starts at the minister's level. So those were also very keen. Some of the things we have seen is if the national government is involved, that is the president or the prime minister, then it becomes much, much easier for the country to collect the data from other institutions. But this is still an ongoing process, and we will make recommendations or observations at the end of the report. Then step 4, this is basically consider how different institutions arrangement facilitated the stakeholder engagement, and how are these stakeholders engaged, which is again the next step 5. Were they engaged in workshops? Were they engaged? Were those workshops segregated in sectoral basis, or did they just engage government processes or government institutions? And some of the things that is coming out quite strongly is some of the government just looked at government development plans and projects, and then from those projects they drew their needs, which are captured in the report that they submitted. So the various approaches and the various institutions, how these were engaged and how they were involved, will determine a lot what kind of needs come out from a country. So this chapter will be looking at that. Next, please. Some of the challenges we are observing during this chapter is mainly the inconsistency in the definition or in understanding of various terms. For example, you see a lot of countries do have a mix-up between approaches and methodologies, but that is not a major challenge, because then if they're describing a certain method, then we can be able to deduce from that what was the approach adopted by the country. So, but this is one of the major challenges, that in terms of definition of what is an approach or what was the process, there is some level of confusion there. There is also limited information in most of these chapters where the countries are discussing about the processes they adopted or the approaches. Some of them are just 2 lines or just a very summarized version of that process, which complicates fully understanding what was the main processes and approaches, which we see in the future it might complicate how we do a kind of a summary, but we'll try to do our best to get that out. Next, please. Yes. Some of the opportunities we think will emerge from this analysis. One of them is identifying some of the good practices or some of the best case studies from different countries in terms of the approaches that they employed, and also in terms of institutional arrangement. Again, we understand different countries have different socioeconomic context. So when we are looking at this, we'll also consider the situation of the country and some of the major processes that were adopted in coming up with these needs analysis. Some of these is, for example, if the country was interacting or consulting with the private sector, did they look at the private in terms of am I muted? Can you hear me? Okay, in terms of processes, how are the private sector engaged? Did the process engage the private sector central body, like trade unions or such, or did they engage private sector in terms of the sector they work on? For example, in the energy, where the private sector in energy called aside together and discuss some of their needs. And this we hope is going to generate some insights and good lessons, and which can be shared with countries in the future. Next, please. There's some very interesting processes, or some of what we are seeing currently as some of the best practices. This might change, I have to say, as we look at more countries. But this is a 4-step process that most countries are using or adopting in identification of their needs. The first step is usually engaging the high-level stakeholders to ensure that they get their buy-in and secure their high-level buy-in. And this is engaging the presidency, the cabinet, or the prime minister level. And then after that, there is the establishment of institutional arrangements. And this is basically the establishment of institution coordination framework. What we are seeing in most countries, the ministry in charge of environmental issues is at the center of this. But some countries also differ, and maybe as we do more analysis, this might change. The third step is consultation with the stakeholder to gather and compile their needs. How different countries are approaching how to engage the different stakeholders is very interesting, because then whose needs are captured and how are they captured? Those are interesting questions that we'll ask ourselves moving forward. Additionally, the fourth step is combining all these needs and defining or putting them together and defining them as country needs. So these are what is emerging now, but as we look at more countries, it might change, but this is currently very strong. Next step, yeah. So the next steps, moving forward, we are going to continue looking at more countries to gain insights, basically on the approaches and processes, and cluster these as I have identified earlier. And then after that, we are going to identify some of the good practices, or we might call them some of the case studies that are emerging quite strongly on this. Then we are going to summarize those findings and then compile them into the final report. And that is it, mainly for chapter 3. I will welcome my colleague Sandra to continue with chapter 4.
Thank you so much, George, and thanks a lot to the co-facilitators and to the Secretariat team. Good afternoon, colleagues. Very happy to see many familiar faces. My name is Sandra Guzman, and I will introduce the work that we have been doing for chapter 4 regarding underlying assumptions and methodologies used in determining the needs of developing country parties. Next, please. So first of all, I would like to talk about the approach that we took for this specific chapter. As my colleagues expressed, we concentrate in this first stage in the analysis of official documents that countries have been submitted to the UNFCCC, such as the NDCs, the VURs, the NATCOMs, the NAPAs, and the official documents. And this analysis was conducted in the sample countries that we choose for this first iteration. The first work that we did was the identification of methodologies, because it's not always clear, or there is not always any specific sections that talk about methodology. So we did this analysis identifying the methodologies, how they were used, in which cases they were used. And based on this, we work in the actual characterization of the methodologies. The aim was to understand the key features of each of these methodologies, what were the underlying assumptions of these methodologies, and to be able to understand how these methodologies are actually helping to the characterization of the needs in the different reports. And finally, we try to identify the actual gaps that exist so far. For instance, the disaggregation of information, the description of the specific steps, or if there were different approaches in the use of these methodologies. In this point, it's important to say that the use of methodologies to characterize needs varies a lot among countries. There are not necessarily patterns or specific steps that the countries follow, but it's possible to identify that there are methodologies that are used more often than others, but it's not necessarily a consistent pattern. So it was interesting to see that sometimes even countries not necessarily rely on methodologies to characterize their needs, but rather they use other approaches to do so. Next, please. So first of all, it is important to say that the methodologies are basically divided into big categories, quantitative and qualitative formats. Most of the analyses that was founded in the reports shows that most of the needs and the methodologies that have been used are qualitative, are rather descriptive, and in this case, we are trying to characterize and to create kind of clusters to identify these big two set of methodologies. These methodologies are used mainly for adaptation and mitigation needs. For instance, in the case of mitigation, we can see that besides the methodologies to estimate the emissions in specific sectors, countries tend to use, for instance, certain methodologies such as the life cycle analysis or the LEAP models to identify general needs around specific sectors. So for instance, in transport, energy, waste, or a specific analysis of needs per sector. In the case of the adaptation analysis, it is possible to see that many countries follow certain methodologies provided by the UNFCCC, such as the technical guidance for the construction of the NAPAs or the NAPs. So the countries are using methodologies that have been provided for the UNFCCC, although they also use other international or regional methodologies for these purposes. It was also identified that some information about loss and damages, and also it was possible to characterize certain methodologies that have been used for specifically for capacity building, technology transfer, and financial needs. In the case of capacity building, most of the information or the methodologies that have been applied are for the development of human capacities, but also for knowledge management capacities or other related to the process of data. So for instance, the capacity building needs assessment methodology is quite is used often in these reports. In the case of technology transfer, it was also possible to observe that countries use different approaches to define the needs in the technology transfer. But the actual technology needs assessment methodology that was also provided in the context of the UNFCCC has been also used quite often in countries. And it's possible to see that these type of methodologies are, again, applied mainly by sector. So it's kind of like an expression of the needs are like rather by sector. And the actual analysis of financial needs is where we can find more methodologies that are more quantitative focused. This is countries are analyzing, are estimating how much the specific needs cost, and they are applying different methodologies to arrive to specific quantitative measures. They again use different methodologies to do so, but most of the quantitative analysis is regarding the financial specific needs. You can see also, if you go back, Sama, please. If you can see also that the analysis of methodologies varies according to time frame, short, medium, or long term, and also different levels. So the methodologies are applied for central governments, but also there is information for local governments or other needs at the community level. Now, next, please, Sama. So just in general, I would like to emphasize some of the initial observations that we got so far. So it is possible to say that countries present further information in recent reports. If we see the first national communications, for instance, the information, it's rather general, and in recent reports it's possible to observe more information, but it's still very few of the reports include a specific, for instance, a quantitative data about specific needs. Even in the countries that provide more information, the description about the use of these methodologies is limited. Only few countries present in a more explicit way the methodologies that they have been used, and also the actual description of these methodologies. Most of the countries that use qualitative methodologies, also sometimes present limited disaggregation of information. So it's not always possible to understand how these actual needs were identified. But one important point is that countries have expressed their interest to improve the use of these methodologies. Particularly, there is an interest in analyzing further the actual financial needs for mitigation and for adaptation measures, and they express also the necessity to receive support to do this analysis. Next, please, Sama. So regarding the next steps that we are going to follow in the next weeks and months, so we are going to continue with the collection of data, not only from these official documents, but also from other national reports. And we are also going to analyze other regional and global methodologies that have been submitted and that exist in the climate change framework. And the aim is to provide further description about these methodologies to understand better these underlying assumptions and how these methodologies have been helping to actually characterize the needs. And the aim is to present specific case studies about the use of these methodologies to identify also further gaps in the use of these methodologies. And the aim is also to identify ways to overcome the actual gaps that exist so far in the reporting system. So these are the main steps that we have been following for chapter 4. So we are going to be very happy to receive further advice in how can we keep working in this analysis, and happy to also continue the conversation at the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. And now I hand to Athena.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon and good evening. It's very good to see some familiar names. This is chapter 5. Obviously, this work will draw on the previous chapters 2, 3, and 4. So these are all preliminary and emerging observations. Next slide. So the way we approach this chapter is primarily, of course, to call and harvest observations from the chapters that AD, George, and Sandra presented. This chapter is supposed to summarize not just the challenges and the gaps, but also emerging opportunities and some of the practices, good practices and approaches that developing countries are doing in determining their needs. This is also the chapter where some of the co-benefits in the determination of both climate finance needs and needs associated with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, will be identified. Next slide, please. So again, these are all emerging and preliminary. We've identified 3 major challenges and gaps in this first needs report. I think you've heard from my colleagues several challenges in the completeness of both the quantitative and the qualitative data and the sources that countries are using to determine their needs. There's also a wide variety of representation, underrepresentation in particular, of some of the costs associated by sectors. I think once we do some of the case studies from the 11 countries, you will see there's a differentiation of needs based on the scope and the timing. Some have more information around particular sectors like energy and transport, but less on other sectors like waste and forestry and agriculture, for example. I think the second major challenge is really around methodology and approaches. You've heard from Sandra a wide variety of methodological approaches being used in determining needs, both for mitigation and adaptation. And really, this is the first of a series of reports that we're going to do. So hopefully there will be an emerging set of standards and approaches that countries can use. I think the other difficulty is in terms of the assumptions that countries are using that obviously impact some of the methodologies and the quality of the analysis emerging out of that. And finally, which you've heard a lot from George in chapter 2, there are good examples of what countries are doing to start their processes in determining needs. But several countries have raised serious technical capacity issues in existing ministries to track the data and enhance the quality of analysis too. There are also some challenges involved in terms of intergovernmental processes. Next slide. But apart from challenges and gaps, we do want to devote a section in this chapter highlighting some of the good examples that countries are doing on the ground. You know, we're calling it quote unquote best practice or good examples tentatively in this chapter. Some of the few things we've seen, I think they're good examples of how countries are integrating their climate finance needs in national budgeting processes. This is not new, but especially with enhancing nationally determined contributions, there's been more examples along these lines. Not a lot, but there have been a few examples of how countries are beginning to think about their climate finance needs together with the Sustainable Development Goals and their implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the Addis Agenda. The third, as George said, is there have been good examples of interministerial institutional arrangements, whether there's one ministry leading it or an intergovernmental set of processes have been introduced to help determine the country's needs. The fourth, which again is discussed a lot in chapter 2, are good examples of how governments and countries have undertaken processes for different kinds of stakeholder consultations and engagement, which hopefully will enhance the granularity of the data from the countries. And then finally, and we see this in some of the TNAs on technology needs assessments, there have been a few examples of how technology needs have been converted or translated into investment plans. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps, obviously this chapter will draw from the work of the other consultants and the other experts. We're hoping to get more insights from the people on this call. We are continuing the work in identifying not just gaps and challenges, but emerging opportunities and good practices, again, from the countries. And then we will summarize all of this into the findings of the report. So thank you.
So thanks very much to the team for those presentations. Allow me just briefly to introduce myself, Matthias Strumri. I'm the other co-facilitator of this report. So we now have just about half an hour for a discussion and questions on the work of the report. I guess many of you would have also been with us during the stakeholder meeting we hosted in Bonn earlier last summer. And so looking forward and happy to see your further engagement with us in taking this report forward. Just a brief reminder of housekeeping rules. You can raise your hand if you want to make interventions. And you can also send short questions or comments or inputs to the chat or comment functions. And then towards the end of our discussion, we'll be coming back to next steps, then taking the work forward. So I'd like to open the floor for any comments and suggestions or questions to us as co-facilitators or to the team on the presentations made. And I see there is a question on the getting copies of the presentations. And yes, I would suggest, if it's not already announced, that the presentations will be made available on the UNFCCC website. There is a dedicated website also for the elaboration of this report, where you can find earlier notes and also other material in relation to the report. So I would suggest we make those also today's presentations available there. And maybe the Secretariat could also send the link to the website to the participants of this call, so everybody is aware where they could find information. I see there's a question coming from Yoko Tri Hayato. Please go ahead.
For climate change financing fiscal policy agency. To the last presenter, I'm just curious with the first statement, how to link it among the climate finance together with the SDG achievement target, particularly if we see the current condition, particularly on the coronaviruses right now, how to inline among the climate finance and SDG achievement. So this is my first question, and the second question regarding on the how to give like the best practices in climate finance into the national budgeting process. Just your small information that in Indonesia now we already have the like the best practices to synchronize climate finance and national budgeting system. Start since 2015. I started from the mitigation aspect, and now still continuing this process. And since 2018, we add not only mitigation, but also adaptation. So now we have a very completed process on the national budget system to integrating climate finance and also national budgeting process. So this is my small information. Thank you, Matthias.
Thanks very much. I didn't get everything what you said, so I hope the team took good notes and will be able to reply. I suggest we take a couple of questions at a time and then go back to the team. So next on my list would be Bas van Reuven, please.
Yes, hi, here's Bas van Reuven from IASA, Austria. Thanks for these presentations. It looks like this will shape up into a very interesting report, and I'm wishing you all the best, actually, especially for the first chapter, to get a consistent picture out of all the very different data that that you might be collecting. And I wanted to add is that we somehow must have missed the first call for input here, but are planning to actually provide data and research to as input to the report, and especially based on the work that we also presented at the expert meeting in the Philippines last year. What we presented there was the paper by David McCollum on investment needs for different temperature targets and from different global integrated assessment models. And so this will help you with some of the questions I think that you are raising here in helping with sort of consistent data across regions at a more global level, helping with looking at different temperature targets and what the investment needs would be at different levels. And also by helping to scope out the relation with the Sustainable Development Goals as this paper, especially and these data, are about also the investment needs that would emerge from eradicating the potential negative impacts of climate policy on meeting the SDGs, right? So not so much meeting the SDGs themselves, but what would be if you have climate policy and that inadvertently impacts meeting the SDGs, what would be the additional investment needs that you would have in order to avoid those negative impacts. And so that I hope that could be a useful contribution, and we will be compiling that to send it your way.
Thanks very much. And just we'll be coming back to that as well, but there will be an opportunity to contribute further as we will be prolonging the call for evidence, which was issued originally in December, but that will now be prolonged until a later date also in the summer. So we'll come back with the exact dates on that. I'll just for this first round, we'll have a question also from Amr Abdel Aziz before going back to the team for reflections on the questions posed. Please.
Thank you very much. This is Amr Abdel Aziz from Egypt. I just have a main concern about the structure of the report because our understanding that the main objective of this report is to identify the actual needs of developing countries with actual numbers. But what I can see from the discussion and the outline of the report is that it is concentrating or wasting like 80–90% of the effort on assessment of methodologies, on institutional arrangements, on the gaps, but not really devoting the needed resources for identification of the actual needs of developing countries. I'm not sure how to solve this at this stage, but this is a major concern that I see. And in our view, we should treat this as we do with emissions for developing countries, where we really start with the low quality inventory, for example, or low quality numbers in the beginning, and then by time we can improve the methodologies and we can improve the numbers. But I think we're kind of diverting from the major goal of this mandate, which is to really obtain the actual numbers and the actual needs of developing countries. I'd be happy to listen from the co-facilitators and the presenters their point of view on this issue. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a very good question. And could I maybe just before passing the floor back to the team, just address that particular question as you raise? I mean, we're working on the basis of the outline which was agreed by the SCF in its meeting in October, and then I think also, it passed through the COP in Madrid. So that's that's sort of the approach taken by the team in developing the various chapters is of course then based on that particular outline. I acknowledge the fact that, as you say, there is a lot of focus on methodologies. I would assume that since this is the first report of its kind, that is what we would see as a useful way to sort of develop the working methods of elaborating this kind of report. So moving forward with these kinds of reports in the next versions it will be possible to take also another kind of approach. But that being said, I mean, I still the kind of the call for evidence, as I said, would still be open. So any kind of additional contributions which would be found out there, we're more than happy to receive those, to make sure that we have as a coherent report covering as many various sources as possible. Could I also just, I saw there was a question on the timeline, which might be of interest also for others from Joe Twaits. And I mean, the timeline of the report will be shifted in as much as we'll be getting a new date for COP26 when we will be delivering on the report itself. But I mean, at least from our side as co-facilitators, and as they here, correct me here, but I mean, our approach is to keep the work, keep up the work that we're doing, and then obviously we'll have more time towards the end to finalize the report once also we have a date for the next COP. Zahir, do you want to come in here, or shall we ask the team to reflect on the first questions posed?
Thanks, Matthias. I just wanted to come in here quickly, just because what Amar said is also, led in my own mind. When we conceived this decision in Katowice, the essence of what one was looking at is that, there's a lot of talk of from developing countries about responding to the needs. And if you look at a lot of the financial mechanisms, a lot of the NDBs, everybody talks about responding to the needs, but we did not have really a definitive UNFCCC report that articulates what the needs are. And that is one of the reasons why this whole process was started. I understand that there may be gaps or things like that, but at the end of the day, that's just me personally, when I get a report, I would like to get a sense of what are the needs that developing countries are talking about. And I'm less concerned about, what were the methodologies by which they came up with these needs. I mean, it's the same issue we have on quantifying climate finance. We still don't have a common way of defining it, etc. But yet we continue presenting all kinds of flows of what climate finance is and that. But I'll leave it to the team to respond. I don't want to, because we have very little time. So maybe the team can give a response to some of the questions asked.
Yes, so team, we have, if you just reflect on those first couple of questions, and then we have Alpha and Gareth also wanting to come in. So team first, any reflections on the first couple of questions?
ID speaking here. I wouldn't mind to respond to the first two questions. So in particular, I think for the SDG finance and climate finance, it would be a very interesting analysis. Although there are some comments in the room chat about that these two will be separate, but I think there are also interlinked that we should recognize. I think call for evidence if there is any particular example from countries, because I'm aware that there are so many attendees here that you think is a good example. Please bring that forward, because that also has been discussed quite or come up quite often in the discussion among the team and also among the SCF members. So I think that is a very important point. Thank you very much to bring that forward. Secondly, I also acknowledge the climate finance has been quite or very mainstream in climate budgeting process in Indonesia. I think that there is also extended question regarding how developing countries need, in this case Indonesia, climate finance needs can be also taken from that process or more formally summarized or reported coming out of that budgeting process. That will be an interesting, if there is any particular practices that is happening, either it is in initiatives or maybe in a kind of informal way, and how this can be more sort of formalized and recognized. I think that's it's an interesting evidence by itself. It can, if it can be submitted through call for evidence, it's gonna be very much appreciated. So I think that's my first two responses.
Thank you. Matthias, can I jump this?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much. I just would like to clarify some points that I have seen in the chat. So first of all, just to remind that one of the examples, one of the sample of countries that we used was for this first iteration because of the time that we had to process the whole information. But the final report will include information of all the countries. No, just to clarify the approach that was taken for the first iteration, but the second will include all the information for all the countries. And the second point is that, of course, at this point, we have been analyzing a lot of data. All of the data has been quite, it's complex to put in one specific table to be processed and analyzed. But of course, in the second iteration, we will bring more information about the actual specific findings, let's say, of the analysis. So we have been a lot working in the process of information. That is, as my colleague mentioned, it's quite a lot. We are talking about 2,000 reports only for countries, and the idea is to include other information from regional and global reports. So just to emphasize these 2 points about the scope of this first iteration. Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else from the team wanting to come in now?
It's Athena. Just to briefly add to my colleagues' responses. First, just to clarify, I think there's a comment on the chat from Kamal, and I think Amir might have brought this up. The team is following the guidance from the outline, as the co-facilitators mentioned, on how we capture the co-benefits in the country processes and approaches in determination of their climate finance needs with SDG needs. So I acknowledge your point that, of course, those are 2 very separate things. But as one of the earlier experts said earlier, some of the countries, as they develop their methodologies and conclude some of their investment needs in relation to climate finance, they are unexpectedly also hitting some of their own country targets as far as specific SDGs are concerned. And we're seeing this particularly with SDG 7 on energy access for some of the countries at ASEAN, which is a regional report that I was involved in, for example. So we're treating that just based on capturing co-benefits in determination of needs. I think the second point, we hear you very clearly, Kamal, Zahir, and Amir, that I think this presentation tended to highlight a lot of the methodological and data gaps because we are at the very first stage, 0 draft. But as Zahir mentioned, there are 1,200 national reports that we're combing through. We're learning a lot about what the countries are doing, different processes and approaches. So we're hoping to come back with the first draft, not just through the 11 case studies, but bringing in the texture and the granularity of what is already available out there. And there actually are good examples of countries that have gone as far as determining needs, so attaching some of the costs, financial costs associated with those needs. So we're gonna just have to figure out how to capture those. Again, the deadline for call of evidence, I can see some experts who are on this call who can actually help put much more country-based examples into the next draft of the report. So we encourage you to share those with us, please. Thanks.
Thanks. So I think we'll then move on to the next round of questions. First from Alpha, please. Are you still with us, or shall we take Gareth first? Alpha, do you want to go first? Let's just see if someone else is raising their hand. I can't see that at this point. So Gareth or Alpha, if you want to come in.
Yes, hello, this is Gareth.
Hi,
Can you hear
please
me okay?
go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Distinguished co-facilitators, SCF members, experts and participants. My name is Gareth Phillips. I'm the Manager of Climate and Environmental Finance at the African Development Bank. Thank you for the opportunity to attend this event. I'd like to commend the SCF and UNFCCC Secretariat for organising the meeting under the current circumstances and for the work done so far to advance the delivery on the mandates for the next COP. As you've provided us with a first outline and background paper, these form an excellent basis for further work. And as we advance the collection of information, we would appreciate fleshing out of the regional specific needs of the final report. I'd like to put the issue into context in view of today's challenges. Firstly, while the global restrictions have some positive effects on climate change, we all know that this is temporary and the statistics will only reconfirm the impact of human activities on our planet. In fact, the current crisis is only adding to the multitude of other acute challenges for sustainable development on the African continent, which has the most countries in a conflict or post-conflict situation and most least developing countries where millions of people are struggling on a daily basis. And in addition, Africa is most affected by global temperatures, but receives least climate finance support compared to global levels. Now, I'd like to reflect briefly on how to present aggregation of data and information and how to categorize methodologies and processes. Many African countries lag behind in the collection of accurate climate data due to a shortage of capacity at all levels, systemic, institutional, and individual. Capacity at national level is insufficient even for assessing the needs and accessing finance to support to meet these needs. As a result, countries struggle with delivery and the growing reporting requirements. Indeed, the UNFCCC transparency and reporting processes have built-in flexibility for LDCs and SIDS to provide information at their own discretion, such as on the biennial update reports and the NCs, including the timing. Whilst this is accommodating to a certain extent, meanwhile, the needs and challenges are only compounding. Information is becoming outdated faster than it can be collected and reported by the most vulnerable. Therefore, we have to understand and accept that any reports are just a snapshot in time and do not reflect accurately the full magnitude of present or future needs. And it is important to accept that African countries may face unexpected and/or growing climate challenges until the next snapshot. The current state of information technology allows for real-time reporting managed by governments. Nationally collected periodic data can be complemented and updated with recent global, regional, and bottom-up analyses to provide a more complete picture. The African Development Bank has a range of financial instruments to support African countries with climate action, and we collect information relevant for this report at country and regional level, which can be used to compare the African continent to other regions in terms of needs for finance, technology, and capacity building support. The information is captured in a range of reports and publications, which in view of the time restraints, I won't list just now, but the bank can also assist with drawing information from various multilateral and bilateral funds, which we access or host. However, different methodologies have been used for collecting the data, and the information is not structured as a ready input to the SCF report, so it will require further analysis. And finally, I'd like to reserve some space for more detailed input in the near future. I would like to emphasize that this first SCF report on the needs of developing countries is considered a very important opportunity for the African Development Bank to inform the international community about the full magnitudes of the needs of the African continent for climate finance and support, in addition to the information provided by individual member states and other organizations. We think that our input will service also those regional member states which are currently facing challenges to focus their efforts on providing input to the UNFCCC process due to the current COVID-19 crisis and other security issues or extreme events. I would like to inform you that the bank is in the process of hiring a consultant to collect relevant information on the needs of African countries as input for this report in accordance with the agreed parameters and approach. The consultant will start working very soon, and we aim to finish this work by mid-July. We would like to reserve some space for providing written input on information, sources, and methodologies, and would like to make arrangements for collaboration outside of this meeting. Thank you once again for your hard work, and I hope to see you all when we come out of the current crisis.
Thanks so much, and specifically for reaching out for further dialogue, and we definitely look forward to engaging with you and your colleagues in going forward with the report. And as I said, we've extended the call for evidence, so that would be one opportunity. But happy to take that discussion also offline. And I think you point to a number of important messages in taking this report forward, and how to make sure that we're building it as inclusive as possible, to make sure that we're using all the information out there. I mean, obviously, just UNFCCC reporting will not be sort of covering all the various reports which are already out there. Next on my list is Edgar Salinas, please.
Hi, first of all, yes, thank you to the Secretary for organizing the meeting, and to the co-facilitators for the presentations. From the process point of view, I would like to ask whether the outline is already a closed process, is a definite outline, or whether based on the feedback that you are collecting in this type of meetings, there could be adjustments to that outline, because I think the overall sense is that it is too heavy on the methodological process, and perhaps as some of the participants would like to see more focus on the actual identification of needs. Second question is whether, because this is an ex post process, no? So we or the team goes to different countries or analyzes the data, and then you determine what's the state of the art in terms of reporting needs. And the question is whether there could be a space to provide recommendations and say, well, needs should be expressed in such and such a format with this minimum content of information and data, well, provided that there are already some challenges for countries, governments, whether it's national or subnational, to actually collect the data. That's the second question. And perhaps more of a recommendation along the lines of working on the outline to see whether the final report could deliver a more valuable information, and perhaps facilitate the engagement of multilateral development institutions, is whether we could, or the paper or the outline could work on sectors. So whether it's economic sectors or social, in terms of education, infrastructure. And one of the gaps that we have observed at CAF, Latin American Development Bank, is that many regions, such as Africa, Garrett just presented a nice a brief situation of what the African Development Bank does in Africa. You have a lot of literature, whether it's IPCC or different think tanks, saying the region is vulnerable. But at the bank, we don't receive an amount of loan request or financial solicitation to develop programs and projects that matches what the literature says in terms of the vulnerability of those regions. In other words, the literature says the regions are very vulnerable, but the banks do not receive the amount expected in terms of projects and programs for credit operations that matches what the literature says. And then is the development financial institutions that go to the countries, to the regions, and they try to assist governments in putting together projects. Such is the case of the African Development Bank that is well documented in the background paper, and the IDB also does it. We at CAF do it too. So all in all, the question is on the process and whether we could adjust and make recommendations for a more comprehensive outline, perhaps reduce the amount of sections dedicated to the methodological process and start working on sectors, and perhaps be more proactive in terms of what would be the actual format or minimum content from the biennial reports when it comes to reporting needs. Yeah, I leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I think we had Alpha's questions were you can find in the chat since they had the difficulties connecting with the audio. And I think I have no more speakers on my list, so I think we'll be wrapping up this part of the of our discussion today on the NDR. Just to come back on those particular questions, and Zahir, of course, you come in here as well, but on the outline, yes. It has been agreed by the SCF and endorsed by the COP in Madrid. So that's the outline that we're working on, and that we're following in the elaboration of the report. When it comes to potential recommendations in the report itself, I think that will be something which the SCF will be discussing in taking the work forward. I mean, if there is a consensus within the SCF to have recommendations, then I guess that could be a possibility. But as you can see from the report right now, it's not part that we're not at that stage of work in the report as it is right now. When it comes to sectors, I mean, in my view, that's the one of the approaches that we're taking within the report to outline various various thematic areas and also various sectors, and trying to distill all the kind of facts we have in the various reports available. I mean, as been highlighted by the team as well, there's quite a lot of reports to go through. So there is a lot of information out there, and I guess one of the challenges for us is to present all the information available as coherently as possible, and to see how we can make if there are any conclusions to be drawn from the various information already available. What the report finally will come up with will be a result of the information which is already out there. I mean, that's, I think, an important point to make as well, that we, in writing the report, will not be making any studies of our own. We will just be building on the information which is already available, both through UNFCCC reports and also through reports from other actors like regional development banks, by UN agencies, and by other actors like bilateral donors, for example. Trying to make a good compilation of all those various reports already out there on determining needs of developing countries in implementing the Paris Agreement and the Convention. Zahir, anything else from your side before I wrap up on our topic?
Yeah, just briefly, thank you very much, Matthias, for that, and thank you very much for everybody for participating in the call. Just a few. You noted that Matthias mentioned that we're working off the outlines developed by the SCF, but I just want to give people be assured that the work that the SCF is doing is work that is not for the SCF. The work that we are doing is work that is in response to what the COP has asked us, and it should be work that speaks to what people are wanting to see read, etc. So please also be assured that we as the SCF are responsive to the needs of what the parties are asking us to do. And obviously we won't be commissioning any work in that, but we will be looking at the report and developing a report that is responsive to what the parties are asking us to do. We will look at it, how we structure it within the existing outline that we have. And we will be working with the team and the secretariat together with the SCF to make sure that we produce a product at the end of the day that speaks to what parties are asking or have tasked the SCF to deliver for them. So with that, Matthias, thank you very much from my side, and you can wrap up. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And I also just was informed that we had a couple of comments on our YouTube channel as well. And we will duly take good care of those in taking the work of the report forward. Thanks so much to Lydia and to Peter Rowan. Peter had a question on how natural capital and circular economy investments can be used and factor into the economy. And Lydia had a question on how the report will capture policy needs, and that it would be useful for sections on methods to appear before the overview of available information to provide context on the data. So just to briefly to Lydia's question again, how the report will capture policy needs. I mean, if they are evident in the reports which we're using as a basis for the needs report, they will be reflected in the needs report as well. And thanks for the suggestions also made on the structure, and also the input from Peter Rowan. So with that, I'd like to wrap up our session on the NDR. Just as a reminder that the call for evidence is prolonged, so the Secretariat will circulate the notification which contains more information on the types and information of data which we're looking for. And we intend to have more webinars going forward, and of course we'll keep you informed of those. And again, hoping that the Secretariat could also circulate the link to the dedicated website on the UNFCCC website for the report, so you can follow follow developments in the elaboration of the report there. Thanks very much, and I'll hand back to Secretariat colleagues for the rest of our discussions today.
Thank you, Matthias. Thank you, Zahir. Participants, we're now going to take just a 5 minutes break. We've had a lot of rich discussions, so if we could just give ourselves a few minutes break, and then we will be back shortly with the biennial assessment discussion. Thank you.
So good afternoon. I think we will be starting with the second webinar on the biennial assessment, if that's okay for everybody. So yeah, first of all, also on behalf of both Saini and myself, welcome both to all the contributors and also to the experts on Zoom and on YouTube. This is definitely a good way of having a virtual meeting in these times. So first time, my name is Vicky Nunes. I am a SCF member since 2018, if I'm not wrong. And together with Saini Nafo from Mali, I am the co-facilitator on the 2020 Biennial Assessment and Overview of Climate Finance Flows. So just as with the webinar on the needs determination report, the objectives of this webinar is to provide you all with an update of the ongoing work of the SCF for the preparation of the fourth final assessment. And give you an introduction on what has been going on so far. And of course, the main objective is to invite you to share your thoughts and information, particularly in relation to the guiding questions, which were also included in the agenda that was sent prior to this meeting. So the organization of the webinar is very much the same as with the needs determination report. So we will firstly briefly introduce the background to the biennial assessment and the overall approach of our work, followed by handing over to the team to give the status of the individual chapters of the report. And after the presentations, we will open the floor for discussions and questions and so on. Hopefully that we would have about 45 minutes for participants to make interventions. So next slide, please. Again, the housekeeping rules, just to keep this discussion going very smoothly. Please keep mute if not speaking, and thank you for doing so. Do not share screen or files during the call, and use the chat functions to send messages or raise hand to make verbal interventions. And I already want to thank the Secretariat of helping me out in making sure that we keep a track on everybody's questions. Again, just to remind you what the biennial assessment and overview of climate finance flows is all about. I mean, the ones who has been doing this for a long time already know that this is one of those flagship activities of the Standing Committee on Finance. And this BA, the 2020 biennial assessment, will be the fourth in a series of BA published since 2014. So we do already have a long track record of making biennial assessments. Next slide, just to give you a quick timeline of how these biennial assessments have been approved, mandated so far. So initially it came from COP17, which is already dating back from 2011. And repeatedly at each COP, we have gotten some let's say, guidance or recommendations by the COP to highlight certain topics relevant to understanding the climate finance flows. Some of these are reflected in these slides, but I also would like to highlight that having the fourth biennial assessment also allows us already to identify certain trends over the years. So it's also very helpful to see how climate finance flows are going through a series of years. So also just to highlight that each biennial assessment is, the technical report is always accompanied by recommendations by the SCF, which also highlights some key elements identified in the technical report. So there is a clear linkage between those. And the biennial assessment, for those who are, it is being published every two years, and it's focused on the finance flows of the preceding 2 years. So the 2014 BA assessed flows in 2011, 2012, the last BA flows in 2015-16. And then for the fourth biennial assessment, which focus on the flows from 2017-18, we will have also the identification of trends from the previous years. And just as with the last year's biennial assessment, there are some chapters coming back, which we all know, like the methodological issues related to transparency of climate flows. Then, of course, chapter 2, the overview of climate finance flows from 2017-18, including information on those identified trends. Chapter 3 will then assess these climate finance flows, considering the implications of their purpose, composition, effectiveness, access, and emerging trends relevant in the context on the UNFCCC. But this BA will be the first BA who actually has an additional chapter coming from a recent mandate from the COP, which will map information relevant to Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, including its reference to Article 9 thereof. So the zero order draft, which contains already several placeholders, these are highlighted in yellow for inclusion of further information. And of course, these placeholders we use because of different reasons. First, not all data and information is available at this time. Of the available information, secondly, not all has been analyzed yet. And thirdly, there is still a need for further discussion guidance required prior to the elaboration. So on the next slide, which is about the milestones in the development of the fourth BA, you can actually see how this is being developed over the recent months, while taking into account the recent developments, of course, as well. So at the last SCF meeting, the SCF agreed on a general outline and the work plan of the report, including its outreach activities, which includes this webinar as well. On the basis of that, a call for evidence was launched in November, which so far attracted 20 submissions, of which 2 from parties. And I do want to thank everybody who already submitted its evidence for doing so. These submissions are available on the information repository page within the SCF website. And we also want to extend the deadline. So just to encourage more interested organizations to make a submission. So if you still feel like you have available data, please feel free to share it. You have time until the 30th of June to do so. So building on the initial work undertaken last year, the technical team has begun work starting with information and data gathering and the drafting of the individual chapters, and they will present this shortly. And the call is really to make sure this extension of the call is to make sure that we have the opportunity to discuss the latest developments on climate finance and issues relating to mapping information relevant to Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. So that was a very brief introduction. I will now like to invite the team to introduce the approach for the core chapters, which we will start off with Patty to discuss chapter 1. Then we will go straight to Chavi for chapter 2, followed by Charlene for chapter 3, and finally Chantal for chapter 4. And like I said, after that, we can have a discussion. So Patty, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Vicky. So for those who may not be that familiar with the biennial assessments, the first chapter on methodological issues mainly deals with issues around the measurement, the reporting, the verification of climate finance flows, and various other impact indicators or metrics associated with that. So this slide shows our approach to the chapter for the fourth BA. There are 2 main sections that we're looking to make some alterations to. The first one there is the first section. Section 1.1 would be a simple introduction, and then 1.2 is this first substantive section that talks about the updates and trends and methodologies to track climate finance. And the main change we would be making there is consolidating a lot of the methodological issues on tracking, specifically between international climate finance as well as domestic level climate finance, public and private finance tracking as well, all into one subsection, so that is in one area, and that can speak more directly to the information that would then be presented in chapter 2 in its various ways on the overview. So in this chapter, in this subsection, we're certainly interested in looking for the updates and trends, particularly around issues around estimating private finance mobilized by public interventions, as well as on domestic level tracking updates as per previous recommendations in the biennial assessments published in the past. The next section will be on reporting climate finance under conventions. That would mainly focus in detail on the information on financial support provided and received in biennial reports from developed country parties and biennial update reports from developing country parties, as well as looking at how the data is available on climate finance from the operational entities of the financial mechanisms such as the Green Climate Fund and the GEF and the Adaptation Fund. The next subsection will be on operational definitions of climate finance and use. So this is also highlighted there because it would be a new type of change to the chapter in previous years. And this section is currently responding to a mandate that was agreed in COP25 for parties, inviting parties to submit their views on the current use of operational definitions of climate finance. But it would also be interesting for us to know what other stakeholders regard on current developments in this area and how that may affect climate finance definitions in the future, such as in relation to taxonomies. And then the next section talks less about the finance and more about the impact outcomes that the finance is trying to achieve and trying to take account of what the latest methods used for that area. In particular, we're interested in areas focused on adaptation and resilience and how to measure the impact of climate finance in those areas, as well as, of course, gender issues related to climate finance too. We would be looking to pull out any latest methodologies or approaches in assessing that area as well. Then the final section in this chapter would be following on previous editions to the report, looking at whether the emerging methods and metrics relevant to tracking consistency with Article 2 and C. And this, of course, subsection would be aligned with the main information available in Chapter 4. So key issues for feedback, as I've kind of quickly overgone there in the last slide, that we would like your input on. We have received some submissions on this already, so we're very much grateful for them. The first one would be around the current latest developments and updates, particularly around those areas I mentioned, private finance mobilized, as well as domestic level climate finance tracking, as well as climate finance received by developing countries. The spectrum of operational definitions of climate finance and use and how they might be best reflected, and the best practice cases of taxonomies in use or under development. And then finally, the best examples in your knowledge of impact metrics and outcome methodologies that are currently in use or under development that will give us more of a sense of what the finance is being used for and whether it's achieving the outcomes we wish it to achieve. And with that, I will pass on to Xavi for a presentation on Chapter 2.
Thank you, Padraig, and many thanks to the co-facilitators and UNFCCC team for organizing this webinar and participants from joining us in different time zones. I'm Xavi Meadle, and I'll be now presenting a brief overview of Chapter 2 on the climate finance flows. Talking about various elements that we're trying to capture in this chapter, new additions to the chapter, and what are the gaps and limitations in tracking climate finance flows. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Yes. Actually, next slide, Patrick. Yeah, so here what you see is the onion diagram, or what we call the onion diagram, that has been used in the last BAs to present the global climate finance flows. The outer shell is basically different shades of blue, which indicates global climate finance flows by sector, depending on the completeness or data quality markers that we allocate to each of the data sources. And the inner shell you see is in the color of different shades of green, kind of indicates flows from developed to developing countries with UNFCCC funds at the core. And in the next few slides, I'll attempt to simplify the onion diagram. Moving on to the next slide. Just a quick word, what we are really counting here. We are basically tracking tracking primary investments into productive assets and projects that contribute to address climate change, and not capturing any secondary market transactions, except when we're looking at databases for Article 2.1c, which I'll talk about later. And to ensure there's no double counting, we also kind of exclude subsidies that's solely targeted to pay back, investment costs. Moving on to the next slide. So here is kind of unveiling the onion diagram. So as per the approved outline, we first discussed the global flows in section 2.2, which captures both public and private investments, in all these sectors that you see on the slide, renewable energy, energy efficiency, transport, and others. Moving on to the public side, section 2.3 will provide details on expenditure by national and subnational governments. And this section will be informed by UNDP's finding from their domestic climate expenditure reviews, the CPEIRs, some countries' reports on data on expenditure through BURs, and various other country-level landscapes of climate finance, which are conducted by various organizations like I4C, CPI, European Forest Institute, and others. So that data will get captured here. The discussion on international climate finance is kind of bifurcated in two sections. So section 2.4 will capture the South-South flows, where data, wherever and whenever data is available. And section 2.5 will talk in greater detail about the flows from developed to developing countries. And we begin discussion on bilateral flows from government and their agencies, DFI funds, and then talk about, multilateral flows, not only from development financial institutions, MDBs, but also, climate funds. Moving on to the next slide, on the private side, flows are often kind of confidential in nature and, consist of what we are able to capture here consists of mobilized finance data from either MDBs and bilateral institutions or international investors in the form of foreign direct investment. And these will also be mentioned as a subsection in section 2.5. Just to mention about two more important sections that will be housed in section 2.5. Are a section on recipient perspective, where we'll highlight how the bilateral and multilateral finance is channeled through various public and private intermediaries and recipient entities. And also we'll talk about discussion on instruments which are used to kind of deliver these climate finance, such as grant, loans, equities, guarantees, etc. Moving on to the next slide. Moving on to the next slide on data quality parameters, etc. As per the outline again, each data source is assessed against various data quality and completeness markers. A high level of data, I don't know if somebody's microphone is on. If you can please switch it off. Thank you. And as per the outline, I was mentioning that, each data source is kind of assessed against data quality and completeness markers. So basically a high level of data quality is important to ensure, that we are confident that the finance is climate aligned, and the project investments are kind of consistent with a low GHG emission and climate resilient pathway. So a proposed method for aggregation of the total climate finance flows, and it is only relevant to the onion diagram that you saw there, is to provide sort of a lower and upper bound, something that we did in the previous BA. And idea is to present kind of total estimates by various sector, by various themes and sectors from various sources, and provide a lower bound, which basically sums up the databases that are of high quality, data quality marked, plus refer to as climate finance. Moving on to the next slide. So here you see, different shades of blue kind of shows the assessment of these data available based on those markers. And if we start from the top row, which is on the private side, our usual, we have the usual renewable energy data sources like BNAF and CPI. And on the energy efficiency side, we have, the IEA, which provides a bottom-up sales versus top-down estimates sort of approach. So a bottom-up analysis kind of uses sales and investment data on sales of efficient goods. That's what being captured there through IEA. And on the transport sector, again, we're working closely with the IEA team, that kind of produces the global electric vehicle outlook investment estimates. And this year, we'll also be adding charging infrastructure to it. I'll talk about it in a while as well. And please note, that these estimates will be, of course, updated retroactively based on availability of data. Moving on to the adaptation sector. So, Yeah, that is one of the where we have like sort of limited data availability, especially on the public side. So public finance numbers are sort of reported through various DFIs, but we are kind of reaching out to various other transaction databases, etc., to kind of have an estimate, or to have some private private investment estimates on adaptations. So we're still in process of reviewing these data sources with other authors. Story is very similar on the agricultural, land use, and forestry side as well. So we've been able to capture some annual public investments in this area, but again, there's lack of data availability on the private investments. We again reaching out to other data sources like Forest Trend and Rainforest Action Network and others to kind of fill this gap. Moving on to next line actually, which is on the public data. So we are still in process of finalizing the BRs and BUR data and awaiting response from UNDP. But we have received data from OECD on for 2018 data on bilateral and multilateral flows, as well as submissions from AFT, the Joint MDB Group, IDFC, and others. So completeness of data is quite high, we can say. On the domestic finance side, as Patty mentioned, I think that's one of the areas we want to provide a better coverage. So, and we're kind of still looking at various databases as well. So for now, we have like 6 countries we've been able to track through various national tracking initiatives that, which are done at various country and province levels. So that is, that's still, and we're also awaiting numbers from UNDP as well. So hopefully these aggregated assessments and data will be ready by the June draft. Moving on to the next slide. Just to give a sense of new updates and new additions and how we're trying to improve our data coverage here. As I mentioned, we are including the EV charging infrastructure from IEE this year. We also have trying to improve, checking our various databases to better capture the non-energy infrastructure like IG Global and other blended transactions. And these includes these non-energy infrastructure investments will include like water, waste, and mass transit. We also looked at climate bond initiative data as well on use of proceeds data for various private and municipal green bond issuances. As part of the UNFCCC this chapter, we also kind of reach out to DFIs which are not being able to capture in various databases that are readily available. And we had a decent response. So because of that, we've been able to add 8 to 10 new to additional database on data on additional DFIs as well. So European Development Finance Institution responded, and we know we have other few other DFIs that responded to our survey request. Also, we're looking at climate finance spending by cities through CDP data and CBI data. And also, additionally, another theme, we know that OECD data kind of provides gender markers to their data. So we'll be analyzing that data as well to see what narratives can be provided on the gender aspect. And currently, just an update on where we stand. We are reviewing the OECD Act 2018 data. We are looking at UNDP CPIRs, BRs, and BURs, and kind of work on the financial instrument and recipient chapters as well, apart from fulfilling all the gaps that we have on other chapters alongside. Moving on to the next slide, which Chantal will talk about later in chapter 4, and this is more probably relevant for chapter 4. But here, CPI for the first time in the last PA provided some methods and matrix that various private financial actors have undertaken to produce kind of a qualitative and quantitative information on capital, stocks, and flows. As I mentioned, we introduced it last year, and we're going to further align this with chapter 4. So this is still work in progress. And when I mean like qualitative and quantitative assessments, I'm talking about, say, for instance, investors conducting climate risk assessments, stock exchange, including green bond listing processes or value of green loans, all these sort of different indicators across various categories that you see here: bond market, listed equity, private equity, insurance, and other, so on and so forth. Moving on to the next slide, I think it'll be great to get your feedback and ideas and comments, on, say, the visualization of the onion diagram. Also, talking about the aggregation methodology of these global climate finance flows. Are we looking for the range of onion diagram, range for the whole onion diagram, or ranges of different layers, etc.? Also, special help will be needed on filling out the data gaps, especially from adaptation and agriculture, forestry, and land use, and domestic finance as well. So, also any other things that you think would be relevant to be included in terms of analyzing the databases on different quality parameters, or even structuring of the report. I know there's limited one on the outline, but yeah, these are the things we would like to really solicit your opinion and feedback. I will now pass on to Charlene Watson, and thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, Chavi, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the chapter on assessment of climate finance flows. On the next slide, thank you. You'll see that structurally the chapter is going to remain much the same as previous year's BAs. It will first take a look at thematic and geographic distribution. It does that by taking a look at a subset of climate finance flows, and predominantly those from developed to developing countries. It looks at data from BRs, from the OECD, from Climate Funds Update, and from the MDBs. And where we can, we complement that with other data such as from IDFC. It then goes on to look at the effectiveness of finance best we can by considering some of the topics such as access, where it looks at, for example, accredited entities, the types of accredited entities that exist for particular multilateral climate change funds, and the finance that flows through those for their projects. We try to understand a little bit more about the pace and cost of these flows. So looking at, on average, how fast it takes to get through the process. And we will try to look a little bit more, depending on the availability of data, as to the disbursement of this finance. So the difference between how much is approved and how much is reaching the ground. And where possible, look into literature that can explain and help us explain that. We also look a little bit more into ownership, where we look in more detail at some of the national systems that are evolving. These could be national tracking systems, or it could be national climate change funds, for example, and the institutions that are being built for responses to climate change. We will also try to make links with needs where possible, but of course, with reference to the needs report that's happening this year. And we will also look at impact of climate finance. Data on impact is predominantly based on that from the multilateral climate change funds, which is where the most data and the most complete data exists. But again, as with all topics here, we complement each section with as much data as we can find that's valid. And finally, the last section of the effectiveness chapter talks about global total climate financing context. Of course, with the advent of chapter 4 this year on Article 2.1c, we'll make sure that this chapter doesn't overlap with any of the content in that. For this year, we're going to try and make sure we highlight specific information if there is sufficient data available on, for example, financial instruments to address loss and damage. This will be looking at what literature has come about in the last couple of years, if any quantitative analysis has come about in the last couple of years, for example, from the WIM, but as well as other institutions. We will also try to emphasize as much information as possible on least developed countries and small island developing states that, of course, have exceptional mention under Article 9. And I think Vicky has already mentioned that we'll use kind of boxes where appropriate and where necessary. And of course, in gender on climate finance, so the previous BA looked at gender and climate finance from the perspective of governance of climate finance, as well as access to climate finance, and of course, in impacts of climate finance. We'll try to do the same thing here, again, looking at the latest kind of data information. On the next slide, please. Just a quick update on where we are. We're already updating the information on the implementing entities. What's interesting this year is that, of course, some of the implementing entities are coming up for re-accreditation. So it'll be about how we manage that in the data and the presentation of the data. But of course, there's that, and we're also assessing the flows that are going through that. I've already mentioned the fund lifecycle costs. That kind of analysis is already underway, as is an update and review of what's happening on the National Climate Change Fund perspective and with respect to climate finance tracking systems. And I think here we'll try and bring in as much as possible work that Chavi has already mentioned on CPIR, but also, for example, on the Coalition of Finance Ministers that have tried to link these tracking systems with public financial management. What we'd like to do, we're just seeing how much data exists so that we can prepare an analysis of climate finance readiness efforts in a more structured way. So previously we have just mentioned a few initiatives, their kind of common characteristics. Where possible, we'd like to try and develop that analysis because the volumes of readiness, climate finance readiness finance are growing. And it will be great to look into the effectiveness of that. And of course, we're reviewing the submissions that have come in for the BA in addition to the needs assessment. Outstanding, as Xavi has already mentioned, we're just awaiting confirmation of data. The data kind of cascades down through the chapters, so particularly for the thematic and geographical analysis. We're also just ensuring that we don't overlap on chapter 4 on consistency, as I've already mentioned. And then with the remaining sections that I've already mentioned, we're just going through the updated literature review. Great. Thanks. So the final slide just highlights a few questions that I thought would be useful to pose to the group. I've already mentioned that we're hoping to elaborate and look at climate finance readiness in a more structured way. So if there are any comments on how we might do that, or if there have already been studies that do that, we'd be more than willing to hear from you. The second would be, how can our analysis on gender and climate finance be more detailed? Again, what's the latest literature on gender and access, gender and governance, gender and impact? And then finally, if there's any kind of new thinking happening on how the BA can be more useful to the UNFCCC process or other processes outside of working on the convention. So we're really interested to hear, how you're using the assessment chapter of the BA and what kind of things it would be useful for you to see within that. But I'll stop there and I'll hand over to Chantal. Thank you.
Chantal, are you still muted?
I think Chantal might be trying to dial in at the moment, so maybe we could wait.
Let's give her a minute.
Yeah, 1 minute or so.
It doesn't seem that Chantal is able to join at this point. So maybe while we are waiting, we could already look at some of the questions that were posted on the Zoom group chat, if that would be okay with the other consultants at this point. So I did note some of those down. I think there are two questions around the climate finance definitions, both coming from our dear colleague Kamal. One is about how do you deal with the different definitions from different sources, and the other one is about climate finance definition, on which one the BA is being based on. So maybe I think both Patty and Xavi, you might be able to respond to that question. Who wants to go first?
I I can try to go from the methodological point of view. Since the 2014 BA, there has been a kind of working definition of climate finance used for the preparation of the BAs, which is generally based on the IPCC definitions of climate mitigation and adaptation. And so how data is found that is in relation to climate finance and use in the report or reflected in the report in the report is based on that working definition. But that's a separate issue from section in chapter 1 where we're looking at the operational definitions of climate finance in use by various different actors, various different parties, as well as institutions, financial institutions, and climate finance data providers. And so in that section in chapter 1, we're looking at the overlaps, the commonalities between them, if there are, and also the differences. But this is something that is subject to review as we receive those submissions from parties that were invited from the COP to submit their views on this issue. On this issue. So if there are any further inputs or comments on that particular question from different parties or non-party stakeholders, we would be very much open to that. But Xavi, I'll turn to you to talk about specific data treatment questions on climate finance in chapter 2.
Sure, Paddy. So yes, we agree that, data have been gathered and compiled from, sort of multiple sources to arrive at these aggregate that of global climate finance flows, including, say, for instance, even from developed to developing countries and flows from developing countries, South-South cooperation, etc. So different, it's acknowledged that, different data sources probably have their own operational definitions and underlying concepts, such as climate finance or climate change and, various sector delineations. So wherever these reporting differences are there, they have been explicitly laid out throughout the chapter when we talk about those databases. On your second question on data quality, how are we assessing that? So the two basic parameters that we're using here, one is on data quality and second is completeness of data sets. So on the data quality, we're trying to see if basically assessing the quality of financial transaction that's available in the data set. So project or project level data, including say geographic source and destination of flows, which tend to be reliable, are marked given a higher rating. And again, I mentioned that a high level of data quality is basically important to ensure that those flows are kind of consistent with low GHG emissions. So we are looking at different methodologies that these different databases look at. And on the completeness marker, we denoting basically looking at the coverage of these various climate-related flows in a given sector. So sort of a high level of completeness would really mean that, more and full granular information is available on the various sources and instruments and sectors, etc., that allows us to present in this chapter. There was also another question on, identifying and tracking adaptation finance, and it'll be good to kind of also have subsectors related to RE transport within that. So yes, yes, I mean, we totally agree with it. There are significant data and reporting challenges that limits our ability to capture these adaptation flows. And of course, these are mainly because of regional or local vulnerabilities, which determine whether adaptation resilience, which kind of determines the adaptation resilience outcome. But we do wherever data allows us to capture these different categories within adaptation, be transport, water treatment, etc. So those those estimates will be made available throughout the chapter.
Okay, thank you, Xavi. And I've just been informed that Chantal is online. So maybe Chantal, we can first listen to your presentation, and then we work further on the questions. So questions that haven't been responded to, of course, we will tackle them in a moment. But maybe Chantal, you can first give your presentation. No, Chantal?
I think she just dropped off again. She must be having connectivity issues from calling in from South Africa.
Yes,
and then she's gone again. So we can continue with the questions.
Okay. So then, yes, we will continue the questions, but whenever she makes it, let's give her the floor straight away so that she doesn't have to wait. Because I don't think it's a lot of slides, but I think it is crucial to present all different chapters. Yeah, so we already tackled the questions on definition and the sectoral approach, which were quite important questions. Then there is another one about the differences between the data quality used from different sources and differences between how you make sure that difference between the financial flows provided versus private finance mobilized. Xavi, could you also perhaps have a look at those? Because I do think that's about how it's going to be featured into the different chapters.
मिर्ची तुमने नहीं खाया तुमने नहीं खाया
Okay, so maybe Charlene, you've received a question about how assessed financial instruments migration mitigation when assessing the financial flows. Question to you, could you respond to some of those?
Thanks a lot. Yeah, no problem. So unfortunately, at this moment, we're only able to look at the financial instrument from the kind of the starting point, the initial context. We're at this moment not able to follow the flows down for each of the project examples. I think it's a really interesting and it's a very good point. And particularly about when it goes down through different institutions. But the very simple answer is that we actually look at it at the first step. So the financial instrument is by the kind of, for example, the project that's approved and how much of it is a guarantee or a concessional loan or a grant. So that's actually what we're tracking at the moment. I do take on board your point. It's a very interesting one. And I'll make a note to see if there's any way we can either somehow try to find kind of going forward a way to try and track that, or at least to mention it. I think that would be really useful. There's another question from Kamal. Vicky, please stop me if you don't want me to continue. Around how do the assessed financial flows respond to developing country needs? At this point, it's very challenging to try to answer that question. We don't have the full suite of data in order to do so. I know that we're having plenty of discussions around the needs report, and I'm really hopeful that this year we can try to kind of evolve that section of the BA. What we've tried to do is to look at, is it going through national institutions? Are there national institutions that are involved? We are not in a position right now to say, is the finance flowing going to sectors that have been, for example, prioritized in NDCs? So this is almost like an ongoing topic that we continue to try and improve. At the moment, we do the best we can to look at different proxies. But I wouldn't say that question is kind of fully answered, and I'm very hopeful that the needs report will provide some interesting thoughts that we can bring over. There's a question from Carol on the impacts of climate finance and what indicators we're considering.
I was just informed that Chantal made it, so maybe we can give her the floor first.
No problem, Vicky.
Thank you.
Hi, Vicky. Hi, everyone. Thanks for bearing with me. I almost feel like there must be a conspiracy theorist behind this chapter if I keep on getting cut out of the call to try and say my piece. So I'm going to try and get through the material as fast as I can in case I get dropped off again. The exciting thing about chapter 4, and for those that don't know me, my name's Chantal Naidu. I've been working on climate finance for some time, and there are some friends that have signed in that I'm happy to see their names there, and also very happy to work with the Secretariat on this chapter. So the chapter is a new one, and it's going to build on references to one seen in prior years where some elements of information has already been mentioned in prior 2 and 3. So the intention is to build on that, but specifically for this chapter, to try and differentiate it specifically. And because there's not that much specific guidance in the Paris Work Programme on 2.1c, the intention on the approach is to be more descriptive rather than prescriptive. By that I mean it would not necessarily be definitive things that a country can do, but just to rather show interpretations of how 2.1c is being engaged in practice. The idea also is to look at finance flows, yes, but also the system in which the finance flow, and I'll demonstration a bit later in the presentation. And there are obviously some temporal realities of climate responses, just to keep that in the back of the mind. And specifically in this chapter, we're hoping to highlight both the challenges and the opportunities that operationalizing and responding to 2.1c. We thought a useful approach might be to try and deconstruct the components of 2.1c. It's a relatively simply worded but there's some very interesting words there in terms of make, for example, that is suggestive of mandatory and voluntary elements that might be happening. Finance flows references both public and private, another. And consistence would reference nature and trade-off. So these are some of our initial thinking. Pathway, for example, speaks to differentiate approaches, potentially country-specific. And then the last part of the article references low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development, which gives us a sense of directionality and where the contribution of these finance flows materialize, contributing to both resilience and mitigation within a development context. So moving to the next slide, what we thought in terms of content for the chapter would be to look at examples of approaches to 2.1c by different constituencies. So there are a few Paris-related coalitions, and each of them have got some work program bringing up differentiated approaches to greening the financial system and other fiscal and economic approaches that deals with more the system of finance as opposed to the particular quantum of finance. We're looking for examples as well of countries specifically that either have green finance system strategies or green finance strategies, and any other strategic approaches to how they're embedding the Paris Agreement both into their development agenda, but also in terms of their financial system. And also a wealth of approaches amongst the financial system itself, and granted, a lot of these is focused on the major financial centers, but there are elements, for example, the Network for Greening Financial Systems on the central bank side. UNEP Inquiry has got a deep database of measures that they've been tracking, which although they're not directly because they predate the agreement, they are useful things to see what examples are being put in place. And then also you would be aware of the task force for disclosure of climate risks as well. We thought it would be useful just to see if, to the extent that there might be relevance, what other UN processes have been doing and how that might, is there anything we can learn from what their work. So Financing for Development, for example, last year did their seminal report and included a chapter for the first time as well on integrated finance frameworks. There may be something useful we can learn from that. And then also the long history of expenditure reviews. Among civil society organizations as well, there's some really interesting activity which almost is like a litmus test of the kind of things they're responding to and driving. And we thought these are useful just to see how different constituencies are interpreting what does it mean, what does consistency mean in different contexts. And we're hoping to synthesize all of these practical approaches and understand the commonalities and the divergent points what does that mean for operationalizing it. We're also going to take a look at some examples of policy approaches on how financial systems and the approach to the Paris Agreement and sustainability transitions broadly, might be relevant. So, for example, we've picked up literature around ambitious approaches to, engaging on environmental and social sustainability that might determine the demands on the financial system. There's also elements of work around how the characteristics actually influence how the financial system needs to respond, and then work around defining specific missions for finance in terms of targeting specific efforts. So the idea here, to go back to descriptive as opposed to prescriptive, is to just understand what there is, describe it, and understand if there's anything we can learn from it in terms of what does it say about mapping that information for 2.1c and with reference to 9 as well, obviously. So the status of the work currently underway, there's a whole host of things happening simultaneously. There's tracking, trying to just gather as much as we can, and we'd be grateful for anything we've missed if you can give us input on that. Also literature, and that's both the policy work that's been done by think tanks around 2.1c or 2.1c related elements, and any academic or practice-based literature at the same time. And then engaging practitioners, some governments, and included in that, we thought we're hoping to speak to the GCF in terms of what they're seeing in terms of what countries are asking for on greening their financial systems, and then obviously the valuable data that comes from the assessment, and anything that comes from the score will also be useful. On the next slide, I thought I would share with you just a picture of how a financial system would look, and in this case, it's the South African financial system, and it's the networks and the channels through which finance flows. And thinking about 2.1c sort of in a practical context, the finance flows through specific channels, and challenges is probably a good slip. There are consistency issues, obviously within this context, but some of this depend on the circle of influence or the mandates of individual institutions, what can and can't be done. So the idea of this slide is really just to show the complexity of trying to engage on 2.1c and the network of the many actors engaging at all of these different levels. And for some countries, for example, the type of financial system is not homogeneous. Some have bank-based, some have capital markets-based. There's informal and both formal networks. And obviously the level of sophistication between developed and developing countries might also be changing. So this is just to show that space of complexity. And what we're trying to do is at least find examples of things that are being done across the spectrum of stakeholders. What can we learn from that? What does it say about information that might be useful to track? Next slide gives an example of sort of some of the global channels of finance. And I think the main message on this slide is just to show there is, of course, a development finance architecture which feeds into our climate finance architecture, which we are, under UNFCCC more familiar with. But both of these architectures feed into domestic financial systems in developing country context, and in different ways and at different levels. And these are actions that are at a national level. How does a country respond to creating a consistency amongst these, and whose responsibility is consistency? So a lot of questions at this stage, more than answers, but we're trying to think widely and then narrow the scope once we understand what we're dealing with. So to the last slide in terms of questions for feedback, and we'd be grateful for your inputs on both the depth and breadth of data sufficient for this pioneer chapter, and any sense from yourselves of the degree of differentiation across the chapters, because there will be elements of 2.1c already with the work Shavi's doing and Charlene's doing. There'll be references to that. The idea for chapter 4 was to take more of a strategic systems approach and get to a place where we can consider what examples and pathways could countries take in responding to 2.1c. We'd be grateful for suggestions as well on examples, country examples or initiative type examples. We have a few in mind. I'm happy to mention those to you if it's useful. And then, of course, not to ignore the fact that, by the time the next COP is actually going to be had, there's a lot of new challenges that our countries face, and the financial system and finance flows in particular would be challenged to embrace what a COVID-19 impact actually means. And your reflections at this stage of how this might be reflected in this chapter would be very helpful. So thank you for the chance to present, and I'm grateful for your feedback.
Okay, thank you very much, Chantal, and I'm happy that you managed to get through your presentation without falling away again. Now we will really open the discussion. As again, the housekeeping rules, so please mute if you're not speaking. Don't share screen or files during the call, and raise your hand if you wish to make an intervention using the raise hand function in the Zoom participants. Before we actually give the floor to those that are raising their hand, we also received some questions through YouTube. So I would like to just read them out to you, and then, there are 5 questions in total, so I would read them all. Feel free to respond to those questions or other questions you think you haven't responded fully to. And then I would really like to open the floor to give other participants to share their views and respond to the questions you actually asked them. So the first question comes from Peter Roman, who works as a consultant for the European Commission, DG DEFCO, and he has a question about the global flows. He wants to know if you are incorporating natural capital and circular economy investments, and what are the barriers and gaps for doing so. A second question comes from Pushkar Vaidya from the IARF Center for United Nations, Mumbai, India, who would like to know if there are any specific assessment, effectiveness tracking related to financial flows about school-level climate education. Then we have questions coming from Karel Kronenberg, specifically to Charlene, on the impacts of climate finance. Which indicators are you considering to present in the next report? Joe Twaits from WRI asks if the zero order draft of the BA will be made available to observers, which we have done when we had in-session meetings, but of course that might not be so possible this year. I'm just quickly going to respond to this question. I will definitely take it up to our coach with the SCF coaches and the secretariat to see what is possible there, but at this point it's not up to me to decide, unfortunately. Then we have another question from Kamal to Chantal about the deconstructing 2.1c. If you expect to assess the gaps and what is concretely missed to make the Paris Agreement goal, the financial goal, workable and implementable through concrete provision of climate financial resources for developing countries' adaptation and mitigation actions and activities. That's quite a substantial question. And then we have one question about the definition discussion, a lot of questions about the definitions discussion, if a new and additional is taken into account. This question comes from Fiona Ryan-Cairns from the Climate Action Network. And again, another question from Pushkar from IRF Center to know about the school level climate education and climate flows for those aspects. So I would if you feel free to answer those questions briefly, and then, like I said, I would open the floor for those who are raising their hands. Thank you very much. So maybe we go by order. Maybe first, is Chantal still online, or was she kicked out again? I don't see her, so she might be kicked out. So maybe let's go from last ones first. So Chantal, do you have any responses?
Am I unmuted, Vicky?
Yes, you are.
Okay, perfect. You won't believe this, and you all have to laugh at this. The minute you started saying there is a question for Chantal, what do you think Zoom did? It actually kicked me out. So I need you to please repeat the question.
No problem. It's from Kyle Kohlenberg, and it's about the impacts of climate finance. Which indicators are you considering to present in the report? I think yes, that's the concrete question.
Okay, good. I heard a question around the deconstructing tool that I was going to use from someone as well.
Yes, yes. You can also see that one on the Zoom group chat. It comes from Kamal. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Sorry, I can't see anything because I've dialed in by the phone at this stage. So the first question around the impacts of climate finance and how I was going to reflect that in the report, in this chapter. To be honest, I was focusing more on how to interpret how countries are responding to 2.1c. So in some of the UNEP work and the other coalition work, it's more around the ideas at an economic and fiscal level. There's financial instruments, there's regulation, legislation. Some of that is almost too early to understand the impact that it's having in helping to green the financial system or make it consistent. But it would be useful. What I'm going to try and do is figure out from what is being done, what can we find as useful indicators if we can get there. I'm not sure we'll be able to get there for this first chapter, but that would be the long intention. And I think on the impact side as well, it probably is helpful and maybe more suited in the work that Charlene's doing under the assessment of climate finance flows. In terms of, what is it actually doing in terms of making changes. Then on the deconstructing tool around the components of 2.1c, this is a working idea at this stage. It is literally to try and understand these specific words in the context of how they were intended when the agreement was constructed, and to try and find precise and let us use the deconstructed process to help find the information that we might be tracking. So as I don't have a tool per se, I'm using an inductive process. Make suggests there's some regulation, but it also suggests that there's a mandatory component, but possibly voluntary components as well. Just to use it as an example, what does that word evoke in terms of action? Finance flows, what does it mean in terms of scope? Consistency, what does it mean in terms of the direction? And consistent to what, for what purpose? Those kind of elements it's more inductive process of reasoning I'm applying. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you. Then we go to the questions for Charlene.
Thanks, Vicky. Maybe just to jump in on the indicators. For the assessment chapter, we try to look at the impact of some of the finance flows. Where we have the most data is through the multilateral climate change funds. And when we're doing this analysis, we're very much a data taker. So the methods chapter will look at the different methods that different multilateral climate change funds in particular are using to measure their impacts. And then in the assessment chapter, we take that information and we present kind of, what's been happening around these indicators. So what we do is we try best as possible to aggregate some of the indicators and also characterize what are the main features of these indicators. So you will imagine for mitigation, we talk about greenhouse gas emissions reductions, we talk about kilowatts of energy capacity, so on and so forth. And then for the different funds in particular, we can look at what are their expected impacts and what are their impacts that they have said that they have delivered so far. We're not, unfortunately, in a position to kind of go through each flow and look at those or verify those details. And then with, for example, for adaptation, you can imagine much more of it's around the number of people that are impacted. And what we try to do here is, where possible, aggregate some of that. So for example, if it says X million people made less vulnerable, or Y million people made more resilient, the definitions are quite, difficult to elaborate more than that. So we tend to try and kind of group where possible, and also mention those, the kind of what's happening, what are the general characteristics of impact. And also just it touches on one of the other questions. One of the other things that we try to do is to look at mobilized finance through these the multilateral climate change funds as one measure of impact. Just scrolling down, there was another question for me about whether or not we can disaggregate flows between different levels, so whether it's regional, national, or local. In the assessment chapter, the only way we're able to do that is when we're looking at the finance that's flowing through the various implementing entities of some of the multilateral climate change funds. And for those, we look specifically at the 5 UNFCCC financial mechanism funds, and where possible, we look at the climate investment funds of the World Bank. And we try to look at how many institutions there are, and also how much money is flowing to these institutions. But we don't have another way in order to track beyond that, the different levels that the finance reaches down to. I think there was only one other question that perhaps I could, or perhaps two. In the assessment chapter, we do have a paragraph that picks up new and additional finance. What we do is that we review what countries have submitted as their definitions in BRs, and we report back on that. And that again is trying to kind of summarize what countries have included, what countries have not included, and whether or not that has changed over time. And then specifically to the question about whether or not we can track the effectiveness of finance flows about school level climate education, we often don't have that level of detail, whether be it by sector or beyond that in kind of education. So in the assessment chapter, we're not able to do that just by limitations on the kind of the data that we have on sectoral divisions. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Then, Xavi, do you still have any responses to give to the questions that we've raised?
Yes, definitely. A lot of questions were raised on the climate definitions, and do we plan to assess or synthesize those? So yes, in the previous BA, we did solve that comparison for different definitions by from UNFCCC or the OECD, what the OECD DAC uses, and MDB uses or IDFC uses. And we kind of evaluated those on different parameters on level of granularity, what sort of sources are covered under those. So for instance, OECD DAC would be having like overseas development assistance or other official flows, whereas MDBs are countering internal and external resources that are managed by MDBs, etc. On a lot of other parameters, whether they're tracking on mitigation, adaptation, or reporting on recipients. So we're going to be doing this here as well. And also, I think this year probably will be considering including the EU taxonomy as well. But of course, that's subject to discussion between internally with the UNFCCC team. That's my response on the definitions, etc. Also, I think there was another question that you could probably answer is like that was raised on whether we provide disaggregated flows between different levels, be it regional or national and local. So we can talk a bit more about at a regional level, because this MDB joint report has also kind of given numbers at country level. So maybe that's something we can definitely consider to include, and it quite of aligns with the outline that's been laid out. On the local level, I think that's one thing we probably would consider doing and want to do, but because of course there's limited data, on city finance that we're looking at. So we're looking at various different sources like CDP, and consider like which kind of provides total cost and contributions by various local governments, etc. So we kind of evaluating if we can include those databases as well. Also, this year we have another report that's going to be published in Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, the State of Cities by CCFLA. So maybe we can have some insights from there as well. I think another question was probably on what's getting included and what are we counting. Just to reiterate, we are kind of capturing, financial commitments that are made, that are basically primary capital flows that are directed towards low carbon and climate resilient development. We kind of excluding any disbursements data set, because firstly, there's not enough information on the volume or financial flows that get dispersed over time. So that's what's getting included in the chapter 2 on global finance flows. I don't know if I can answer any other question right now.
Let's first see if Patty has anything more to add, and then I will give the floor to those who raised their hands through the Zoom chat. So Patty, do you have any further questions you would like to share your views on?
Just to make it really quick on the questions related to the definitions. So we are, as per previous biennial assessments, there are annexes and sections where we've covered, the various operational definitions of climate finance and use by various parties, and so we're continuing to update them for this version of the report, and also take account of any new developments that have come through, whether that's evidence that has been submitted through the call for evidence or new developments that have been published in the intervening 2 years. Not at least to mention the submissions from parties and their views as well on operational definitions. So all that information is being gathered, and that will dictate a lot about how we synthesize or assess any climate finance definitions and use in the methodological chapter, and how we can review the spectrum and the scope of interpretations. And so when it comes to issues like new and additional, that is something that, as Charlene mentioned, has been captured in the assessment chapter when looking at the additionality question of climate finance, as well as looking at the methodologies of how that has come about in the methodology chapter, particularly in relation to biennial reports. So, and again, as with previous years, that would be something to be updated for this year's report. But I'll stop there so that we can get through to the people who would like to make verbal interventions.
Yes. Thank you, and thank you to all consultants for your extensive responses. So I have two people raising their hand. First, we'll give the floor to Damiana Vizet and followed by Miriam. As you can see, we're going very close to the 4 o'clock deadline, so I do hope you can give a very short intervention and come to the essentials of what you would like to say. So Damian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Vicky. First of all, bravo for this excellent webinar on the web. Excellent. I'm Damien Amizet from the Agence Française de Développement, but I'm really speaking on behalf of the IDFC, the International Development Finance Club, which is a group of 26 national and regional development banks from all over the world. AFD, of course, but perhaps the DBSA from South Africa, the BNDES from Brazil, and so on and so forth. I'd like to first provide some comments on the alignment at Article 2.1.c, just saying that it's very timely that this should be addressed in the report. Indeed, the term financial flow is very significant for institutions such as the IDFC. Back in 2017, the IDFC, together with the MDBs, pledged a joint statement to align financial flows with the agreement. So we've been working on it for quite some time and happy to share. Of course, the rationale is that a development bank in the national context really has a specific role to play, giving the national governments and constituencies feedback on policy, on impact, thanks to their deep knowledge of the social and economic fabric, their wide-spanning portfolio of clients in the countries. So they are in a unique position to do so. So in December 2018 at COP24 in Poland, we published a position paper fleshing out the significance of the Article 21C for IDFC members. Very briefly, that's about increasing finance for climate action, supporting country-led climate-related policy, mobilizing private capital, and putting the emphasis on the importance of adaptation, of course, supporting the transition from fossil fuel to renewables, and also importantly, starting an internal process of transformation within institutions. And now, more lately, in 2019, in New York, we released a study together with the European Climate Foundation, and that was done by CPI and I4CE. That is really a review of the literature on Article 2.1.c and alignment on Paris, which I think should be a useful example for the report, because it's robust enough to be useful not only for financial institutions, and basically it will tell you to apply alignment on the entire portfolio of activities, not only the aligned part, but also the misaligned part. Also, not only about doing no harm, but also developing transformational operations. And lastly, implying that you need to think in the long term, and the long-term outcomes, the long-term structural impacts are sometimes more important than the immediate outcomes. So this is, as I said, was meant to be a set of guidance to be inserted between the Article 21C and the actual way that people operationalize the concept of agreement. So I think it's worth being looked at. It's available online, and I think we shared it in the call for input. It's already been implemented as we speak, included by AFD. Thank you. And I think my colleague Miriam can tell you about the IDFC finance for climate, which is different from the alignment. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And this shows how important this call for evidence is, because this is how we get this valuable information. Yes, Miriam, I give you the floor. You might only have 2 more minutes left, so we can also be very brief, and thanks.
Thank you. I will try to be very quick. So my name is Miriam. I work at the French Development Agency. I will present a few data on climate finance for the International Development Finance Club. IDFC has reported its finance club since 2011. You can find it online on the website. And just to mention that the survey is aligned with the MDB and IDFC common principle for climate mitigation finance tracking and adaptation finance tracking. In 2018, IDFC reported a total finance for climate commitment of 125 billion USD. We also saw that commitment to adaptation projects have almost tripled since 2015. However, we believe that adaptation figures are probably underestimated, as very few members report on adaptation, and the lack of standardized definition and typology is a continuous challenge. It was reported at a level of 15 billion in 2018. Just also to mention that these figures represent flows that are both domestic and international. And if the report and mapping is improving each year, or at least we try to, we are also aware that, of course, more progress can be made. In last year mapping, we had 17 members from IDFC out of 24 who responded with survey. And as I said, we had less member reporting adaptation, 8 last year. And we know it's quite challenging for many members, as determining which economic activity contribute to adaptation or resilience often relies on expert judgment. Estimating private sector mobilization also remains challenging for many members. At the 2019 United Nations Climate Action Summit, IDFC resolved to mobilize a significant volume of finance for meeting climate and development goals. The members pledged to provide more than $1 trillion of climate finance cumulatively from 2019 to 2025, and to increase the share of adaptation and resilience. So IDFC is really determined to address these tracking and reporting challenges. The members of the IDFC are implementing several concrete actions to do so, such as the launch of a 10 million USD IDFC climate facility that will help build the collective capacity of the IDFC members to originate and finance climate activity, and it will also help develop and strengthen the methodologies. So thank you very much.
No, thank you. I mean, this again shows how important it is to get these webinars ongoing. And I have 1 more minute left, so I'm going to keep a very brief wrap up of this session, but on behalf as well of Saini, my co-facilitator on the BA. So just first of all, thanks to the consultants and to all of you for participating in this call. I think it has been very valuable to gain more insights on how the BA should be developed. And just to give you further steps on the next, what you can expect next. So as we know, there will be an extended call for evidence until the 30th of June. With the new timeline, which was also one of the questions about how the corona crisis will now develop a new timeline. This is something that is still under consultation, so we will come back to you when the decision is made. It will also depend on the adjusted dates for the COP. And finally, I do think we might go for more webinars in the future. I do think it is a crucial thing to get your inputs in making sure that we respond to what is requested. So as you can see on the screen, we would like you to submit any further information on the call for evidence to the Standing Committee website. And this also gives me a opportunity to thank the Secretariat for organizing these webinars. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a happy day, happy night, or happy morning, wherever you are. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.